All right. We should be live. Welcome, everybody, to another Game Dev Roundtable discussion here on the Game Wisdom channel. Every month, we like to pull together our panel here to discuss game dev and game design topics. Usually we're aiming this for the third week of each month, but due to scheduling issues and computer-related mishaps, we push things to this week. But we have some very meaty discussions to go on tonight. But first, let us once again reintroduce our roundtable here. So, Tomo, feel free to kick things off.
Hi guys, my name is Tomo Moriwaki. I've been a game designer for 22 to 23 years. Sometimes I say 24, mostly because I forget. Maybe my claim to fame was being the creative director on Spider-Man 2, and I'm happy to be here, guys.
Over to you, Jack.
Oh, I'm sorry. Hi, I'm Jack Mamias. I've going on 27 years in the game development industry, AAA games. I worked on MechWarrior 2 franchise, Heavy Gear 2. I did a bad Spyro game. I was a lead designer of Far Cry and Crysis, and now I'm working on a hardcore space sim called In the Black.
My name is Tim Ruswick, and I run Game Dev Underground, a community of game developers from all across the world, focused heavily on the struggles and the mental side behind game dev and sticking to things for long periods of time, and the whole beautiful part of solo game dev, and not just solo stuff, but a bunch of the everything that's non-technical around game dev is what we focus on. So I'm excited to be here and have this chat.
I'm Sharky. I'm CEO of Nexus Games. I've currently working on Project Triad, which is an unnamed game that is soon to get a name. That is a very interesting card game based off of the Final Fantasy VIII minigame Triple Triad.
And I guess I forgot I should introduce myself for anyone new watching. I am, of course, Josh Placer, and I run Game Wisdom, where we discuss the art and design of games and deal with very unruly hair while I'm still stuck with my pandemic hair for at least a few more days, hopefully. But welcome to everybody, especially those of you who are finally able to catch one of our live casts. And this is going to be another, I think, very interesting discussion. So, I guess for the group, what do you want to start with? Narrative and mechanics or virtual development? Or do you have any preference?
I vote narrative.
That's fine.
Okay.
Cool.
I don't have a preference.
All right. Then
Tomo seemed so excited to get
Yeah.
started. He started early.
I didn't want to say anything, but that was definitely my preference.
All right. So, as we just said, our topic, or our first topic, is going to be discussing the combination of narrative with the mechanics of your game. And this is something that I think it's a very fascinating topic, especially, again, with Tomo and Jack, who have had experience in the AAA market, and with Tim and Shark, who have been approaching these from the independent space. Because I guess here's like my first question I want to ask like the group about. It seems like this kind of discussion used to kind of be like focused, I think, primarily on the AAA space, or even just the AA, just because of, the funding and power behind these studios. Everything from Rockstar, Prey, Horizon Zero Dawn, God of War, etc. Do you think that we are seeing, or have we seen, the independent space approach this merging of what used to be kind of like two different schools of thought? And anyone feel free to start things.
There's a lot of independent games that I think have done it really, really well, like well beyond what I thought was possible. And I think that a lot of those games tend to come from like the narrative first end, and they make their mechanics work within the context of the narrative. And so the thing you do in the game ends up being the thing that the narrative, like there's a lot of AAA games that I've played where it's kind of like, all right, go here and shoot the dudes because stuff, and then okay, go and shoot those dudes, and it kind of feels like, yeah, the shooting's fun, but there's like a disconnect between why I'm doing something and what I'm doing, and AAA is so good at the what I'm doing that it's fun enough, but there's still a piece of my mind that was kind of like, oh, well, that's kind of weird. And it's not until I played some of those independent games where those mechanics and that narrative is so beautifully intertwined where I realized that was missing in some of those other titles. So I think indies are probably ahead of the curve on that one.
Yeah, I would generally be like, the kind of harsh statement I would make is that AAA has really hardly done this at all. At least the true marrying of narrative and game mechanic. I think the AAA games that have kind of excelled on the story side of things, in many cases, have kind of almost abandoned some of their game mechanics, or typically are studios that don't focus on their game mechanics. I think, especially some of the older studios that have excellent controls, excellent action, that they tend to kind of lean away from getting really involved on the narrative side of things. It's, if anything, I feel like the in the kind of indie spaces where this was being pioneered and where the innovation happened and started.
Okay.
Yeah, I'll agree with that too. Indie is definitely where they'll take chances because their risk is less than studios. Studios are going to do the safest, less riskiest thing that's going to make them the most money. And if they think narrative's going to make them money, they're going to hire. I mean, the quality obviously in AAA is much higher because the people they have on Call of Duty are movie people that are the best in the business, and the stuff is amazing and emotional, and it definitely kicks indie's butt as far as quality is concerned. But I'm agree with you guys. Indie is where they experiment. I don't know, is Darkest Dungeon a AAA or an indie game? I'm playing that now, and
That would be indie. Yeah.
that has got the coolest story that is so bizarre, and the way they present it is so procedural but still awesome. It's just it's head and shoulders above what you would see in indie games. So definitely, that's where I see it going.
There's so many things, like you're talking about narrative and just marrying of all that. I feel like Darkest Dungeon is one of those games that when you explain like, oh, you're a dude in a dungeon, you have to like fight these dudes, it's like, okay, that sounds like 10,000 games. But then you look at the execution of how they did that, and the narrator and the colors and the way that the comment is just, there's so much there in the execution of that really makes that world feel alive.
Yeah.
Well, not only that, it's the procedural, as characters, obviously, if you guys have played it procedurally, characters can get paranoid, and then their character's going to act like a paranoid guy, and the story's going to completely change to what's happening. And it's, I imagine it's different every time because, this guy is now a sadist and this guy's, masochist, and they're playing off each other, actually.
I don't know what masochism's about, right, Shark?
I don't think you do.
And
But
I want to throw it to you, Shark.
what I like is when I've seen several indie, well, not a lot of indies, but I've seen some indies out there that not only combine the narrative and this, and the mechanics, but they also combine the music and like everything. Everything just meshes together, like on some of the games out there, and those I think really deserve a special place.
Yeah. And
Well,
oh, go ahead, Tomo.
Oh, I was just going to say, like, in the time I spent developing larger games for bigger companies on big teams, to some extent, the shape of the game is already determined. A marketing department may end up dictating the constraints of the game, and you really can't break too far out from your kind of conventional shooter or your third-person action adventure game. That stuff's kind of set in stone, and you honestly don't want to get too crazy on those fronts because you got a whole lot of people and a whole lot of money. Taking a big risk is very dangerous. I mean, when we did Spider-Man 2, all of the King's men and all the King's horses were crapping their pants that we were going to go open world. And you know what? If I was them and I could go back in time, I probably would have stopped me. Because it was crazy. It was a humongous risk. to develop the open world city in Spider-Man 2 took like 75% of the development time. So if we got it wrong, we didn't have time to try again. All these, like, this idea, like, if you're going to move a mountain, you got to plan it very carefully, and you can't really play it fast and loose. But in my other experiences of working on smaller games, you're doing a lot of experimentation. You're trying things out. And so I think it's, in specific, it's kind of like it's where indies are where it can happen and where it should happen.
Well, also a lot of indie games are slow boil games, so they are done when they're done, and they don't have a marketing and advertising schedule that they have to meet. So they're kind of deciding when it comes out, as opposed to the head of, I know at Activision, the PR guy is the one who decided when the game came out, not the game director. And that was they were, this is when it's got to be, and if it's not there, you need to start cutting. Where an indie game, they can just hold it as long as they want to, or stay in early release forever and hone it, which is certainly going to help the stories a lot better, because you're going to lock down story a lot sooner when you're making AAA. Because certainly, if you're doing something for Call of Duty, you're going to do a huge, you're going to have to do a huge production pass on the story, and you're going to have to do lip sync and animation, and it's got to be super high quality. So that stuff's got to be locked down, way before alpha. Basically, probably like 2 or 3 months into when the game is starting to go into production. As indie games might be doing that stuff up to the last minute.
Yeah. And
to be fair, I do remember doing a bunch of stuff last minute still.
I was working on my game till like 4 hours to launch, because I launched on itch and I could literally release anything. Yeah, it's pretty bad.
I made sure that my game was actually done before I even announced the third release date, because I had told them there would be no more delays.
And we'll see how quiet I can open up my can here. Probably won't be. There we go.
Not very quiet.
Yeah. But getting back to Darkest Dungeon, like, somebody came onto my chat last night asking me about how would you define the archetype for a modded character based on the narrative. And I thought that it's like very serendipitous that we just decided to bring up Darkest Dungeon as our first example, because it is very much a game whose narrative and design are intertwined. Again, as Jack said, like, this is a game where the whole idea is that your heroes are not infallible. They're going to go insane. They may, rise up. And those things are both treated as narrative, by their dialogue and their whatever they say, and then by the gameplay of how those things are then interpreted. Like, when you take the, what was his, not the Flagellant? No, I think it'll be him. The guy who becomes a religious fever, or he becomes a fanatic. When he takes enough damage, he all of a sudden just starts like saying stuff like, more blood for me, or pain is good, and then he attacks an ally, or he may just attack an enemy, and like this kind of stuff, it sounds, I think, easier than it is in practice to do. And I have a AAA example that I want to bring up in the next minute or so, but I guess, like, with something like with Darkest Dungeon, or with like indie games in general, I think from what you guys were saying, it is such an interesting case, because an indie developer can certainly pivot. They can certainly spend as much or as little time with something as they can. And I think, like, one of my first examples, I'm not sure how good or bad this would be something like To the Moon, if you remember that game from, I think it's got to be at least 10 years old by now.
I don't remember that one.
I remember it, but I didn't care for it, so I didn't play very much.
To the Moon,
yeah, that's a cute game.
2011.
Cute game.
Wow.
2011.
I know a lot of people really love it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it is, and I think that's always been one of the interesting parts, because it is considered interactive storytelling, and it's an adventure game. And normally when we talk about games that combine narrative mechanics, they're usually part of the adventure genre. They have some kind of adventure aspects to them. Even something like Outlast, which was more of a stealth adventure game, combined the whole, first-person viewpoint with your camera, and then that became just an integral part of it. But I guess, like, in terms of, like, when we talk about pure action, or games that are more player-driven, can anyone think of good examples of games that have done a job of managing narrative and mechanics?
Well, I don't know. That's a tricky question, because if you're trying to integrate them, the idea is, in my mind, that the game's rules are built fundamentally for this particular game's story. And so in some ways, like, you get some of the kind of, I think To the Moon probably counts to some extent, and maybe games like What Remains of Edith Finch. Let's say they didn't do any additional changes to the functionality of the, let's say, player characters' interactions with the world, and they were still able to tell a very good story. In fact, the elements of those games are good, and the story is good. But then think about all the extra work they did to make that specific story kind of come to life. And then both those games kind of bend their genre or bend the kind of core expectations about their game's design and what the player's agency over the game, and that it happens to be in excellent alignment with the specific story that's being told. And so it's like that integration of same old game, new story, change same old game to meet the needs of new story. Like in the context of Darkest Dungeon in particular, it's like this way to create a dark psychological element to the kind of continuum of the game, and have players choices kind of dictate the outcomes through that mechanism, right? That their insanity is something you have to manage, and that it's something that emerges over the course of the game, and it happens to be in good alignment with the kind of roguelike elements of the game. I think that's where we're seeing the innovation on that indie side of things, because they have that. Well, in some cases, they're not. I think what's partially to blame is that they're not us old school console devs, because us old school console devs were. We didn't have that luxury. We already, like, by the time the early 2000s roll around, I mean, I think, Jack probably remembers just before this all happened, where genres kind of became the thing. But about the time that happened in the early 2000s, you no longer have that choice. You're going to make mechanics based on their ability to kind of be bullet points on the back of a box. And the story is going to be developed on a separate parallel path in some ways, right? That some cases that a lead designer might not necessarily interact with a writer as much. If you go back to early 2000s, these days much of the kind of relationship between story and gameplay is getting better and better and better across the board, of course. And we take Last of Us 2 has to come up, right? There's talk about a high quality narrative experience.
I haven't played it. Don't spoil.
And we don't want to talk about the details of it, but the broad strokes are, a dark action movie.
Last of Us 1 definitely had a great story, but it certainly was linear, very linear.
Yeah,
well, and it's okay if it's linear. And now, how do you boost a linear story, right? How do you make that better? Like, you could take like a Telltale style game that's mostly going to play out the same way, but there are big shifts, there are big differences when it'll happen, and the choices that the players make to make those differences become bringing mechanic and narrative together.
And to your point there, Tomo, about kind of like games, about kind of like gameplay and the story kind of existing as separate entities. Let me make sure I get the name right. All in All Games brought up earlier about one of his favorite examples of combining mechanics to the narrative was Jade Empire. And like BioWare was kind of like one of like the first developers to really go in with that approach, as everybody remembers the whole good and evil mechanic. That idea that the story could be shifted by the player's response, and by the player's response would also shift how the gameplay would play out. If you were
But wasn't that taken from KOTOR?
Yeah, but Nicely Old Republic, that was also Bio. Sure. Wasn't it? Yeah, that was BioWare, right?
That was BioWare.
That put them on the map, the first one.
Definitely. And I think that's kind of where they've gone like that, such a high esteem from fans and critics, by being one of the first developers to kind of do that. Or at least one of the ones to make it such a big success.
I do wonder that, in Mass Effect, right? Like, I think it was the second one or something where you have to, well, there's a bunch of situations where you have to choose between two friends that survive, right? Like, who survives, this guy or this guy? And like the way it's presented is like, pick one. But like, what if you had to like, what if they're both injured and you had to carry their body out somewhere, right? Like, what if that was a mechanic where like it's not telling you to pick one, like you gotta pick one up and like put him over your shoulder and like carry him out, right? Like, I wonder if that would be worth the extra emotional impact for like the narrative, for something like that, just integrating that into what you're doing instead of just like, hey, pick one, like kind of.
So what you're describing then is that the game doesn't explicitly say you must choose Jack or Jill. It's really saying like maybe pick somebody up, or maybe they'll just say you gotta get one of us out of here. Help us up. You go help somebody up, and then let's say as soon as you get them to the exit, something happens and the other character dies.
And you got to deal with that decision. Like, I feel like maybe AAA isn't the best place because I know there's some people who be very upset about that kind of thing, but if you're talking about the emotion and like what you want to deliver, like the feeling of loss, right? Or the feeling of like right or wrong decision, or the ambiguity of just the human nature of, should I have done that or not? And like, I think something like that can really help drive home the feeling. And games that I've played that have done things like that, where what I'm doing, the controls, the physical things that I'm doing in the game are mirrored by the things that are happening in the game, feels so much more, I don't even know what the word is, connected, coherent, I don't know.
And on building on Tim's point, I think that maybe an old mechanic might actually help in there too, but I don't actually know. But maybe a timer, to where if you have a timer to go get them and get them out, and if you don't get one of them out, you can lose both of them.
Yeah, I think it kind of reminds me to a little bit of, I haven't played fully of The Witcher 2 or The Witcher 3 yet, but like some of the choices of The Witcher 1, where there's always that option of you don't have to do anything. You can just say, you know what, I don't care about side A or side B, just screw it and let things play out as they would. And to Deagle's comment in chat about Spec Ops: The Line, Spec Ops is another really good example of narrative and I think mechanics combining into one thing. That was such a shocking game. I still can't believe they put some of that stuff into that game that actually made it into a release.
I mean, they put in a mortar mechanic. I think they probably put it in just so that I could do that one scene and never forget. I mean, we're probably past statute of limitations on Spec Ops: The Line. I think I'm talking about a scene where you're using these a mortar that has white phosphorus rounds, and you're kind of, the way they paint that beginning scene is that you're desperate to break up an attack where the enemy is gathering in like a small area, and so you start attacking with those white phosphorus mortar rounds, and of course white phosphorus is very, very, very hot burning weapon, and it turns out that it's a bunch of civilians, and I think that's messed up. Anyone who's played Spec Ops: The Line, I think, has to be a little bit messed up over that moment. But I think it's a great example, though, right? It's like all the things that we were just talking about, like coming up with timers and trying to figure out a way to make the player involve themselves to make a certain result in the story happen. I don't think it's wrong to say that is the essence of game design, and that really maybe the topic that we're discussing is, where do we see games push what amounts to the essence of game design, which is to kind of connect the story we're trying to tell with how the player can change the outcome of things.
And I'm glad that you said about changing the outcome of things. So I think there's actually 2 points I want to bring up. So the first one, let me go back to to Tim's example about bringing two characters, deciding which character to bring out without really telling the player. Like, one of the things I think we've seen consumers kind of rebuke or go against is when they're not told of a choice, like when the game just kind of hides that information. And there's always, I think, that very careful line you have to walk as a developer in terms of, how open or how apparent do you make these mechanics? Like, again, like we all know the Telltale example. Every time you make a choice, it says, they will remember it when that's a complete lie. And then, like, going back to the Mass Effect point, everyone remembers the whole controversy surrounding the Mass Effect 3 ending. That, everyone complained, why aren't all my choices in 3 separate video games represented at the end of the trilogy? And there's, again, like, there's always, I think, that unwritten contract between developer and consumer that you have to be really mindful of when you're, I guess, do we want to say you're kind of tricking the player, or you're just trying to kind of, subtly lead them around?
I think your choices need to matter in a game. If there's a choice, it needs to matter, and I think it's pretty cut and clear on that. In my opinion,
meaningful play, right? And not the
At least give the illusion that it matters.
Yeah, I mean, I've made.
You guys may lose me. I'm getting a big thunderstorm here, so just want to let you know if I disappear, I mean, the lightning hit somewhere near. Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. That's what you were saying. Cool. I was just going to say that there have been many choices I've made available that aren't necessarily meaningful, but the experience will be dictated by the choices that are meaningful.
Yeah, I think that the experience matters so much that meaningless choices can become meaningful in your head if the game is like doing its stuff right. Like Darkest Dungeon is a perfect example. Like on paper, when you describe this super difficult, ridiculously like RNG, and like your guys permanently die and then they get crazy and they attack each other, like that sounds like a horrible game design. But in the context of a dungeon and like people going insane from these dark monsters and the way that the game portrays that, it creates all these little threads in your head, like, oh, well, he's upset because he has this, so he's attacking this guy. They give meaning to those characters. They give like all these things to it, and those what in other games could actually be bad mechanics could actually like make players go away. In this game, it's got a sort of like motivational factor to it because it's so intertwined well with all of the other systems, even like the saving mechanic, right? Like it saves automatically like almost every couple seconds. So you can't if your characters die, they're dead. It's not like XCOM where I can roll it back and just rerun it like 1,000 times until I'm good. So but it fits within that world, and I think because of that it feels so much more coherent, and you can get away with a lot of stuff that
I think in general those mechanics are bad, but because Darkest Dungeon just built completely around them and encompassed them, they just really made them work, kind of thing.
Are they bad? I think they're good, actually. I like those mechanics. Certainly when I'm a DM playing, I prefer the characters. I have more fun when the characters go against each other and they're trying to, you got a hidden assassin in the party and no one can trust each other. Those games are way more interesting to me than if it's just everybody's a lawful good paladin going through a dungeon. It's just boring,
Well, I meant like when the game is built around it. I mean, as a DM, you can change and flex and build around that kind of thing.
Well, yeah, and I think a way to put it, and maybe this is actually something that we can kind of latch onto, this idea that I think if you go back to a certain point in the history of video games, you'll find that certain features and certain decisions about what is fun and what is not fun were more established in a way, and people have had we agreed that players want to be wowed in the first few moments of the game or something. That definitely felt like an early 2000s all conversations in all kind of console games. But as we go forward in the timeline, we're realizing that actually first and foremost we need to ask, what is this experience about? What are people going through, and is it improved by the horror that you might lose your characters and not be able to go back? Because if we're talking about your Final Fantasy characters, for example, that's a no-go.
Yeah.
But if we're talking about your Darkest Dungeon characters, suddenly it makes the game amazing, and it makes it Darkest Dungeon.
but that's because it was built around those mechanics specifically.
Mm-hmm.
And
Well,
harshness in Harvest Moon, that'd be terrible.
Mm-hmm.
I think. I mean, I played Red Dead Redemption, and as much of a masterpiece as that game should have been, Red Dead Redemption 2, as much as a masterpiece as it should have been, and as much great story as it has, there's you've got the good guy, bad guy sort of thing going, and I don't think it had any effect on the game whatsoever. And no one turned on me, even though you were a bunch of bandits. You could trust all the guys that were sort of in your club, and they were all sort of your buddies and stuff like that. I would have loved the fact that if I'm a bandit and I'm an evil guy, at any time a guy could go berserk or try to rob me or try to kill me in my sleep or something. That would have made the game way more interesting aesthetically to me if that stuff would have been happening, and it would have made the game a lot more immersive as well. Then I kind of get bored when I'm just going through a regular narrative story that even if it's written by the most genius writer of all, and they've got all these emotions and everything going on, it's somebody else that's living. I'm living somebody else's life. I'm not living my decision. So there is a I'm playing as I'm looking at them not only as a third person in the camera mode, but in my head I'm third person as opposed to being that person.
Yeah. And
in real stories, people are trying to get away from the hero's journey because that's still the basis for everybody's story. They're trying to still do the hero's journey and the different versions of it. I believe that's old now, and I think the people who are brave and don't do that are the ones who are going to succeed in the future, because people need something new.
Man, speaking of new, freaking Disco Elysium. Talk about we're just gonna make a CRPG. It'll use mostly all the same rules. But at the same time too, there's this idea what are good adaptations of the same old yesterday stuff that you can use in different ways, right? It's I think some of the ideas of a first-person shooter, and let's just the first time Borderlands came out, that we're gonna recreate Diablo 2 loot, but I'm gonna run around and shoot things, right? That was a great new addition to the timeline of video game development.
Mm-hmm. And I'm glad Jack brought up Red Dead Redemption 2, or kind of like the AAA machine when it comes to this, because this takes me to the other point that I wanted to bring up from a few minutes ago. And it's that issue that, as we said, sometimes the story is so locked, or it's its own separate entity, that the mechanics, I think, sometimes tend to just they don't really impact things. As Jack was saying, he feels like he's just watching, he's just a passive observer rather than the character in game. And an example that I always go back to in terms of one of those issues was the game, what was it? Infamous. If you remember Infamous 1 by Sucker Punch. And the, I guess no pun intended, infamous scene where the game forces you to decide, do you save the woman you love or scientists working on a cure? And it doesn't matter your choice, because if you choose to save, they basically want the girlfriend to die. So if you save the scientist, she dies, that's that story. If you save supposedly her, the game just says, nope, that was just a decoy. She's already dead. And
yeah, that's a Batman.
Mm-hmm.
And it's interesting, right? Because I think if you go back, the further back you go, the more you'll get some kind of complaints about story. Back in late 90s, I mean, it came out of my own mouth, and I'm still embarrassed about it to this day. I would say things like gameplay and story they don't have any business being connected to each other. But that was the prevailing thought of the time. We were fixated on how things felt from second to second, and honestly, I felt like we were leaning away from Hollywood right about a time that the people that were running the companies were trying to lean in towards Hollywood. But I think that also makes sense too. We're on the ground, we're working on tactics, we're trying to figure out how to make an AAB combo feel the best that it can be. And then the other people above us were we just want the user base that likes blockbuster summer movies. And over time, we've slowly gotten there.
But that isn't that what killed Hollywood in a way? Is like, I mean, Hollywood is. I mean, now it's really dead, but it's been declining. Like every year, it declines in ticket sales because people just seen it all. They've seen every story. You know, they've experienced every emotion, and it's just nothing new. And it's, you know, the only thing they can put out are these tentpole movies now. The only thing that's saving Hollywood is Avengers Endgame and bad Star Wars because they're making a lot of money, you know. And Avengers Endgame had an amazing story, and Star Wars had a crappy story, and you know, I mean, one is renowned and one is not. So I guess it still matters, but I don't think we want to go down that. We've got to find our own way in the game industry to find ways to make narrative just another mechanic and not something that the whole game is based on. It's got to be one of the pillars of the core instead of, I think it's got to be one of the pillars of the core. And just as it's as important as the physics and as important as the mechanic and as the art, but it can't be the reason that the game exists, because I don't think that's enough anymore. And I think they've got to have the narrative has got to serve the aesthetic of the game, or they're blowing it.
Yeah, I think what you're saying there is like it needs to be a part of the core and not a skin that you just slap on it.
It can't be...
And I think that we're seeing that's already clear, right? Because the games that do a better job of that, they're getting market success and users are connecting with those works.
I don't think narrative sells games anymore, though. I don't think that's a selling point. You don't see that necessarily on the back of the box that, oh, a fully interactive story is here, right? Where you can play. They don't say that. That's not a feature. I mean, people expect it to be there, but it's not the defining feature of a game now. It certainly isn't on, you know, the big games, because it's like it's just people want more. They want the next big thing, right?
When Shark and I do our Sunday show, we see a visual novel games that one of their bullet points is how many words are in the game.
Yeah, I'm not going to play that one.
Well, that's basically all of them.
And I
think the rise of systemic storytelling as well. Like if you put a player in a sandbox, they can inherently create a story, right? Like I went down the dungeon and I hit this dude and then he blew this other guy up and then caused the chain reaction. I think like games like Far Cry or a lot of the new roguelikes and stuff that are very systemic, they're very like sandboxy systems. We're seeing that generate player stories, and I think what's cool about those versus like narrative is like we are seeing the rise of like Twitch and YouTube, right? Like that stuff's not going away, and it's a lot easier if you've got a very linear story. Like the whole thing with Last of Us, right? That got like leaked early, and a lot of people were super horrified that might literally destroy the game. Whereas like systemic games can't do that because there's a new story every time they play, and it's why a lot of content creators will create 40, 50, 60 videos in a series of the same game, because the actual story is kind of different. Like you've got the same, maybe I'm not using the right narrative terms, but you've got the same like setup and the same like idea, plot. Well, maybe not even plot some ways, but like the same like
backdrop,
motivation. Yeah. I don't know. But like, and then you end up with these different stories. Like Spelunky is a great example. I see so many people like online share or Dwarf Fortress even, like they share their stories, right? Like this is what happened. I've never played Dwarf Fortress, but I've read a ton of stories about that sound amazing in Dwarf Fortress, and then I download it, I look at it.
The AR after action reports for like XCOM have been like, I used to read like 30, 50 pages of stories people have written about how an XCOM match could play out. Right. And like as Tim said, like those kinds of systemic games that really focus on kind of the player controlling what is happening really do like open themselves up to like, these massive, very personalized story experiences.
I think that's the way it should go, but you got to argue that games like that, the story is the weakest part. Yeah. I mean, when we were making Far Cry, we had a story written and we had it voiced, and we literally put it in after the whole game was made, and we would say, okay, how far does it take this guy to run from point A to point B? Cut this out of the script and put that much in there. Right, because they won't step on it. They won't, and the lines we cut millions. We cut half the story when we put it in the game, and we just crammed it in in the middle of gameplay.
Yeah.
And but certainly that didn't win awards for story. I mean, it was a goofy story, and but people didn't care because they felt that they were creating the experience. So you kind of, if you it's like crowdsourcing. You let them do it, it's going to be better. Wikipedia is better than an encyclopedia because a million people are writing it, right? Just like games are better when the players are creating it, I feel.
Yeah.
Nothing against Call of Duty. I mean, it's a masterpiece, but as soon as you play it, if you have to go to a save game, you're absolutely bored when you have to play a section over, because it's going to play out almost exactly the same way, and all the cool stuff is gone.
Yeah.
But arguably, if you made a movie about that story as opposed to a movie about the Far Cry story, Call of Duty is going to be a million times better and a million times more emotional. But I don't think it's as good as an experience because you're not crafting it, and it's not you.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I don't think there has to be a difference between an experience. I mean, the story and the like, we're kind of describing these two things as different, and they both still carry a lot of story. It's just that when a story is specific, it's not as replayable, right? You don't have as much. You have to now increase the quality of the story by a large amount. That specific story needs to be very compelling in order for it to support a linear one-time through sort of storytelling experience. And then these games like Dwarf Fortress, although I think extremely complex systems games, because epictavern is like that, so we love studying this stuff. There is something that's special that goes on there. In fact, a story can be nearly awful. It can be ridiculous. It can totally suck, as long as it's your story. Right? When player agency determines all of the features of a story through kind of systemic emergent results, now every single thing that ever happened was entirely because of me, and now it feels very special. And even if it's kind of awful, it's still kind of cool to me. Whereas Telltale games, obviously totally the opposite, right? That they're going to put a lot of energy into creating very much like carefully built roads of character development over the course of time, and you're buying the game because you're going to walk that path. And to a large extent, same with Last of Us 2.
But that's every multiplayer game ever. You're making your own story,
Yeah.
right? Because there is virtually no story in most multiplayer games, and and it's going to change every time. And there are heroes and villains per se, and there are encounters that you're doing in narrative moments, but certainly they don't exist in a story fashion. It's just the people are creating it as they go. And if you played a multiplayer game and somebody transcribed what happened, that would be a cool adventure movie, right? Once it's already done.
Sure.
But it wouldn't have the VO to back it up because there's nobody talking, right? I mean, other than leet speak over Discord, which is not, that kills immersion to me.
And
I personally like a kind of combo in between, like the big elaborate stories, but with parts of it that change based off the play. Like, just like, maybe not even like super major stuff. Like, I made this choice. So because I made this choice, this quest and everything, this location is off to me because it got blown up. And but now this quest over here is open to me because that one got blown up. Kind of thing. And then there's more in-depth story based off of which path you go, and then when you get out of that section, the paths converge, and then you're back on that linear path kind of thing. Linear with, splits in the middle kind of thing.
Well, don't you feel like if you're playing a first-person shooter, like certainly you could take an Overwatch match and you could create a very interesting story about their interactions through the mechanics themselves, right? And at the very least, the game, if they put a bunch of energy into it, they could have the game sort of message to you some of those interesting interactions and kind of punctuate the moment. And to some extent, then our kind of like our shared experience and our working together and some of the unique aspects of the way that one match goes could be, some features could be wrapped into that narrative effort. But now it becomes much easier to create a story, though. If we were playing. Like if I was playing Civ 5 with you over the course of like 6 months, Now that's a total story, right? That's like literally my faction grew and its techs were improved and upgraded, and then I met this other nation that the AI was using, and maybe we were playing cooperatively somehow, or we just made a deal to play cooperatively, and we're like talking about how things are going where we are in the map. Like, there's a ton of room for that to be happening at that point. Now, Civ 5 would never have to make any of those features because it's already too good and too popular a game. So it doesn't have to get better at that. That'll never happen because it doesn't have to. But as a developer, you could say that I've just imagined it so much that I just want to make that thing. And then you might find that some people love it.
So what about games like League of Legends has a huge narrative behind it, which is, could fill easily multiple novels, and the only real call out in the game is if you take a certain character and another character is in there, they will talk to each other, right? So the story does come through in that, but it's almost hidden in a way. But I get such a thrill when I hear the in-game characters saying stuff to each other. Right, because like, oh, did you hear what he said? Oh my God, he's taunting that guy, and not the player taunt that gives you just a generic taunt, but literally, if Lucian, it goes in there and he meets Senna, they're going to say stuff to each other that you only hear if they take those characters, and only if she kills him will she say that line, right? and it's got a huge, amazing story behind it that you've got to go read on a web page. But it's all in there, and if you go read it, you're going to learn a lot about this. It's going to open it up for you, and it's going to be way more interesting. I think that's pretty cool.
Yeah, I mean, they're similar with Magic the Gathering, because Magic the Gathering has books on top of books. They have like a whole entire library of story for Magic the Gathering, but you rarely even see anything relative to that story in the actual game, and besides the little quotes on the bottom of cards and such, and
that's how they get the story across, are those quotes, right? And that's what makes the cards valuable in a certain way. Is this guy says this little line only on this card, and you kind of view a little bit of his character by reading the line, which is obviously the story is written outside the game. But in a way, you're living the story because you're reading that line, or you're hearing these characters talk to each other and do stuff. So you kind of get a little bit of the best of both worlds.
Yeah, I just feel like they could have done better.
I've never felt like a mage fighting another mage while playing Magic the Gathering, But
well, you're a planeswalker.
Am I the odd man out? But Pokemon, the card game, I felt like a Pokemon master.
That's
true.
Because
I think the game does a better job of conveying the world of Pokemon into the mechanics that you play, like the fact you got to play energy on people, the fact that you've got like these trainers that are doing things and they help Pokemon, like all of this stuff. I feel like, and maybe I'm the odd man out, but Magic is fun. I like it, but I feel like a dude playing a card game.
Whereas, like, Pokemon, I see what you're saying.
You know what I mean? It feels more...
Yeah, but then again, Pokemon is always the same. It's always trainer versus trainer, and it's always the same scenario where Magic is telling this epic freaking story, of magic and fantasy coming together, and it's like those are encounters between wizards that are happening, like in the world. There's wizards tapping mana and sending troops against other mana, but it's not like an arena based thing like Pokemon. So Pokemon has a easier construct to present with that.
I agree with both of you, but I think that Magic doesn't go far enough. Because with Tim, like I agree that I don't feel like that mage kind of thing. Like, I know there's all the story and everything. I know there's these little clips on the bottom, but usually I'm focused on strategy and everything, and all of that just generally just flies past me, and I'm just focused on the game. Where I haven't played the Pokemon game, but like I can picture playing it, and I can picture really getting into it. But again, like Jack said, they have a very kind of very small window that they have to kind of portray, kind of thing, making it far easier to get that point across.
Well, I used to play when I worked at Activision, and I played with a lot of other lead designers. We played Magic, and you better believe the story was there, and people acted like planeswalkers, and they were totally into it. So it was there. It's there if you if the people are into it, it's totally there.
Well, I think that Pokemon occupies a kind of a special place on the planet Earth, right? It is only the largest intellectual property ever.
Only.
And I think that leads us into something about the very old history of video game development, is that Nintendo has been building games that very elegantly connect many things together all at once, right? High quality gameplay mechanics from an action standpoint, perfectly threaded into the story experience they're trying to tell, as well as all these other kind of longer term reward and incentive mechanics that all just, it's like it just fits together like perfectly like Tetris pieces. And it's, it's never wrong to look back at early Nintendo and draw lessons about game design.
Yeah, Nintendo's been on their ball for most of the time, except for when it comes to advertising the Wii U.
Or mobile.
Dude.
Yeah, or mobile.
You just brought back a memory though, because I remember playing like those old school like Game Boy Advance or like really old RPGs, and like my brother was super into them, but I never was. And I remember like he would like go into a bar and like find a dude, and the dude would follow him into battle, and it never really clicked for me. But doing the same thing in Pokemon, like capturing a thing in the wild and then making it fight other stuff, even though it sounds horrible when you say it, that kind of felt like better to me, because I'm like, all right, well, if this thing is like in my Pokeball and I could force it to fight, I guess that makes more logical sense. Some dude in the bar was following me to battle.
They've also got a cartoon Pokemon that really has strong narrative, and if you've seen that, you kind of know the characters already. Where Magic, they don't have that same. They've got novels that are impossible to read, but they don't have that narrative, and everybody's seeing the Pokemon cartoon and Ash and Misty and Brock, and you can feel that. I'd say arguably the same thing as Yu-Gi-Oh is the same thing. Is you know those characters and you know what they say and you know what they do because you've seen them do it in the story.
It kind of draws parallels to Warhammer. Like Warhammer has such an extensive lore and all that, but very little of that seems to be conveyed in the video games.
I don't know. It depends on the video game you play. I mean, if you ever played Space Hulk, the original Space Hulk, man, that was you totally. If you knew nothing about Warhammer, you were playing that and you go, "These guys are insane. What are they? What, wow!"
I love the
they're
manual
like
from
priest
that.
warriors or something, right? I mean, they're like religion is their war. That is so cool.
Yeah,
and,
I had
talking about the old PC
Dawn
game.
of War. Dawn of War actually had a lot of cool story in it too, even though that was just a tactical, an RTT. That had a lot of story in it too, and the characters they did, they had in between, and even in the game they would have a lot of story stuff happening, and it's really strong. And there's never been a Warhammer cartoon per se that you can draw from. I mean, it's still based on a strategic tabletop game, and even though there are books written, those books are so weird that it's hard to tie them into the games and stuff like that.
Wasn't Warhammer the franchise that like I remember reading something about some franchise that got just shopped around to a bunch of people, and a bunch of different developers had licenses, and they were all kind of disjointed.
In the last 5 years, more games for Warhammer have come out than the entire history of time that came before it.
I think Blizzard was working on a Warhammer game, and they somehow got pushed off it. I don't know if it's because they dropped it or Warhammer dropped it, but they just took every single element for Warhammer and put it out and just took the name off. And somehow got away with it. Same with Warhammer 40K and StarCraft. I mean, that is Warhammer. StarCraft is Warhammer, and it's just, it's lifted. And
what's interesting is, I think that their lore and their kind of backstories do have so many parallels, right? Like the history of the World of Warcraft universe has a lot of similar elements that you'd see in like a 40K universe's story. But a lot of that stuff isn't known to players, right? Because so many of the Warhammer games, like there is no Warhammer, like Games Workshop, they never made a game. I mean, they never made a video game, right? They've only licensed it to others, so it was always up to those others. Now, to be fair, you get Relic to do something, it turns out pretty good. But not everyone gets to be so lucky.
As I just want to do a quick pause here, we are just about hitting an hour in terms of this topic, so I don't think we'll have enough time to go into a second topic. We want to keep this about an hour and 15, if that still works for everybody. So,
yeah, that works.
one thing I wanted to bring in the chat, because this comment came up and it was actually something that I wanted to discuss to a point that was brought up earlier. Apox Zeta wanted to ask, what did you think of Dark Sector? And Dark Sector was a game that came out, I think that was last decade or a little bit after that, where it kind of goes back to this point we've been discussing about having the narrative be more involved rather than just being a wrapper or just something for like the first 10 seconds of play and then we ignore it. And the thing that I remember the most from Dark Sector was that the main character was supposed to be born with a condition that he didn't feel pain. And like for like the first like 5-10 minutes of the game, there were no colors. It was supposed to represent him not feeling anything. And then all of a sudden he gets whatever, the armor or the virus, and then he can feel pain again. And then that whole story beat just, completely fades away. And it reminds me, what was the other game I was thinking of? Dark Sector. I just had it. Actually, I think it reminds me a little bit of something like even like Tomb Raider or the Tomb Raider reboot, where story is Lara Croft. She's alone on a desert island, fearing for her life. Hunted by creatures. She's scared. Then you start playing the game and she's running around with an assault rifle, leaping off of cliffs, stabbing people in the neck. She turned, like, one cutscene, she's crying and, she can't deal with it. 5 seconds later, she's Rambo coming out from, like, under an underbrush and, like, slit somebody's throat. And you have that issue, again, of where the narrative is simply there just to set up the game, and then we never hear from it ever again, unless, for a 10-second cutscene.
This brings up the kind of academic term, Ludonarrative Dissonance.
No, I know every developer loves to hear that.
Actually, I feel like those of us that started making games and never went to school for it, that we had to actually overcome our distaste for the academic terms. And I'm well beyond that, by the way. I think that it is great. It is a great word because it describes something so prevalent in games, right? Where when what you do and the story do not gel well, and you can't help but feel it, and it does get in the way a little bit. Because, like, for example, Serious Sam's story, on the other hand, it doesn't get in the way of killing thousands of bad guys at all, right? It's perfectly in alignment. All you hear are guys without heads somehow holding bombs, screaming, and it shakes you to the core.
Yep. And you can hear that from like 50 miles away, just like very quietly.
I still remember my tactic where I'd whip the mouse a little bit so I could get a better idea of where they're coming from.
Makes it easy.
I never played Dark Sector. I can't comment on it, unfortunately. I'm looking it up on Wikipedia now, and I did not play that game.
Me neither.
I didn't play it either.
Oh, I just remember the example I want to bring up. The Surge. The first game of The Surge also had that plot point of the main character is in a wheelchair. He is handicapped. I don't think he can walk at all. And it starts off, it sounds like it's going to be a very interesting story, and then we never hear anything about it ever again once he gets his MacGuffin mech suit that gets drilled into him.
Yeah, because they needed to have a scene, right, where Don Cheadle goes, canopy, 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 or else you would never have remembered.
Interesting.
Now, I think it's easy. Sometimes, and I've been in the room where we do this, right, where we're like, that's a great idea for an origin. Yeah, let's do that. And then part of the reason why it doesn't come up for the rest of the game is because we're so caught up in the kind of the action sequence of the game that we never get her back to the story, right? And was never, like, at the time, it was never our forte. It wasn't our expertise, and we weren't bringing that point of view into the development of the game. I mean, even in the context of Spider-Man 2, it's like we got story guidance from the movie. We got story guide. We would always get permission to make calls on the story, and because of that kind of cumbersome communication pipeline, we just did a lot of things that didn't have story because it was hard or complicated, and we really didn't understand it that well anyway. And I think that you see a lot of that in games, especially early 2000s, right? That's right when we've got big enough and popular enough, and our teams got big enough, and our budgets got big enough that we could do big things, but we never really had to or that enough time had passed from the very or beginning of games, because there's a decent amount of story back then, that we had kind of forgotten somehow.
So then, Tomo, does that mean that your team didn't have like dedicated writers back then? I guess.
Well, we had a senior design. One of the four, we had like there were 3 senior designers, and one of the 3 senior designers was the writer, and he was very interested in the story. And we let any of his we thought we were being so open-minded by letting him have a lot of agency over how the game would go, because if he wasn't our friend, we'd just be jerks to him. Because writers in video games, I mean, I know I'm showing off too much of my early prejudices, but it really was there.
I'm with you, man. I was never a fan of working with outside writers on games because they would try to make it like a game instead of the story, and it would be. And I worked with some pretty big ones. I'm not going to say their names. I mean, shockingly big ones. And the stories they came back with were like, "What is this shit?" I mean, it's like because they try to make it like a game, right? They're like they would try to create game scenarios. And we weren't paying them to create game scenarios. We were paying them to develop characters and story and stuff like that. But they couldn't get it, and they certainly can't deal with non-linear. I mean, that is just beyond them. It's like it hurts them.
It's definitely a different skill because I think you have to have some sort of experience, at least even playing games or something, to just understand the concept of how it all works. I'm actually in the opposite position right now. I've got a strategy game that is mechanically exactly like I want it to, but I have no idea why you're fighting a bunch of units on a chessboard. So I'm trying to figure that out, and tying that together is rough, man. And then
it is.
We're talking about the story that just gets slapped on, and I do that and it seems worse. And I'm just like, well, it's better with no story than just like a slapped on. So I'm trying to integrate it, and I'm trying to, even with the unit design, I'm trying to add story to individual unit. That's why I brought up the topic, because I'm struggling with it right now. It's not easy.
But it can be as simple as the pigs have stolen our eggs.
It can. That's true. I think, honestly, my current story is that an intergalactic space clown kidnaps you and forces you to fight for his pleasure. And it works.
Sounds like a good start.
It works. So I just gotta work out the details, and we're good. But
lots of circus metaphors.
It kind of
when you got to get the character from Ragnarok who is running the planet,
Grandmaster.
Yeah, that actor's the best. Whatever
Jeff Goldblum.
Jeff Goldblum should be the one who's having you fight for his pleasure.
Yeah, and I think it's a very interesting aside. We've seen especially in the mobile space, that kind of story. Somebody forces everybody to fight. Seems to be the most popular narrative for all these IP driven games. There's 2 or 3 different Marvel games that all have that same plot in one way or the other. So and so is making the Marvel heroes fight. So and so wants the Marvel heroes to fight. Guess what? The Marvel heroes are forced to fight again. That just seems to be now. Here's 27 gotcha boxes.
Well, it's hard, right? And it's easy to just slap that on top.
Yeah.
And I think when you've got 10,000 other things to worry about, especially in a game, right? You can't ship a game with bugs. You can't ship, everybody ships a game with bugs. You can't ship a game with game-breaking bugs. And that kind of thing. Some of that stuff can fall by the wayside. And the problem is, there are very mechanically interested people that if your tester pool happens to be made up of mechanically interested people, they're never going to say anything at all about your story. They'll just be like, yeah, this game's awesome. And you don't get that kind of feedback that you're missing that part. So there's all kinds of overlap between audience types, and then there's all kinds of things to focus on. It's really easy for something like story to just kind of not get the focus it needs.
There's something very interesting about Monster Train. I know Shark and I have certainly played. Have you guys had a chance to see that one yet?
I've watched
Monster Train. That's a card game.
It's a deck building roguelike.
It's very similar to Slay the Spire. Matter of fact, the developer behind Slay the Spire has his hands in it in the development.
Nice. Okay.
And the reason why I brought it up is that the game has the story of the game once again is set up just to be that excuse. You are demons from hell trying to reignite hell. That story is mentioned in the opening cutscene. And then very little of that story becomes part of the gameplay, with one exception. Every card in the game has a ridiculous amount of lore. There's at least I think 3 or 4 paragraphs describing the character, what this means, what it all did. That is all hidden behind the UI. The game will not show you that lore unless you explicitly tell it to show it. And
Interesting.
It's that case like what Tim is saying, that for somebody who's mechanically driven, they don't care at all about why Fiery Imp has multi-strike, or why this ice spell hits 3 enemies instead of 2. All they literally see, it's all that mechanic driven. And I think, again, there's that very interesting point about what does the audience expect out of these games. And that's another big thing about narrative design that, again, we could spend another hour or two, we get on this topic, about, the consumer's role in that story, or the consumer's opinion. Because like we've said, some consumers will spend hours building characters, units, figurines, whatever. Other people like myself, again, I've said this before, my character creation is, does my character have brown hair and brown eyes? Yes, we're done. Throw a random name, that's my created character for this game.
I don't know, you went farther into it with XCOM.
To some extent. I at least try to be at least somewhat creative, or I have people submit names like I did with Darkest Dungeon.
It's interesting to me. I remember when I saw Monster Train, I was simultaneously, my head was that sounds like a horrible story idea. Bunch of monsters on a train. But then I was you know what? That is probably the most memorable game name that I've read ever. So it could be a really good thing for marketing, but at the same time, not really make sense narratively. And there's those trade-offs to think about too. If we do some crazy stuff and we name this something really interesting and we have a hook based on that thing, is that better than actually making a cohesive story? Because one of them will possibly attract more people. You know what I mean? So it's
the statement I would make is, how is that not a cohesive story then at that point, right? It's the assumption that the story has to meet the same needs as the other stories we've experienced. It only needs to meet its needs. And that's the craziness of video games, is that sometimes the narrative needs might be 100% alien. I mean, I kind of want to go back to that Angry Birds. It's it's got enough narrative that the most successful cartoon, animated movie ever, probably, except for, Disney Pixar stuff, I guess, or just the most successful cartoon animated movie of the last year, I guess, is Angry Birds. And is that actually true? I thought I heard that. I'm not sure.
Was that successful?
I don't know.
Oh my God, yeah, they did well. And it's the thing is, all of this IP stuff relating to Angry Birds did well, but it's because of the promoting of it. But that's the thing, is one of the nice things about Angry Birds' story is that it's pretty straightforward. It ain't any more than the pig stole our eggs.
And then you have their spin-offs where you are the pigs.
Yeah.
Or it's Star Wars, or it's something else.
When I think children's cartoons, I think you find a lot of stories that are basically half of a sentence, and and it works for them because of their gimmick or whatever their approach is. Go ahead, Sean. Josh.
Yep, and I think, again, when we talk about that, again, there's another top about when we start translating stories from one medium to the next. I think it goes back to what Jack and Tim were saying, that you can, asking a writer to write a story for a non-linear experience is a completely different challenge and skill set compared to writing, something that says this story will take place across exactly a 90-minute film, or 4 episodes of a show. And it's such a very interesting aspect when we talk about game development. Because another game, we brought up a Dwarf Fortress and XCOM earlier, stuff like Factorio, or again, any game that is very much about, here's the player, put them in a space, go, do whatever the hell you want, and let them be, again, the architect and the author of their own story.
Yeah, I think for interactive stories, and I think for really, really impactful stories, you need not to be working with an outside writer, but be working with the inside writer that is a part of the development team, that is in the right in the weeds kind of thing with everybody else. So they actually know what's going on, and they work with everybody else in tandem to create that story. Rather than having somebody from the outside just, oh, here's a story I made up. Good luck putting it into a game.
Sounds like a really hard job.
Yeah.
I'm struggling with it.
As a time check, we are just about approaching an hour and 15. I have one final point I want to ask, and then that will be mine, and then I'll throw it around to you guys. One game, when we talk about games that combine narrative and mechanics together really well, there's one studio that always has to come in these conversations, and that is the guys behind This War of Mine, Frostpunk. I think are they Deck 13? Is that the developer?
Unsure.
Frostpunk, developer 11-Bit Studios. I'm sorry. And like for them, they have been like probably one of the more standout examples of this idea of, we're going to make you live this brutal world, and you are going to do that in this game. Like, there is nothing feels out of place in the narrative, or nothing feels out of place in the mechanics that the narrative doesn't explicitly kind of infer or, force that on you. Like in Frostpunk, you are supposed to be very much, impartial. You don't care about your people, you care about completing the goal. So, like when you hear like the emotional violin music play, and it's supposed to be saying, you see like a child stand there, it's like, yeah, that child's going to work in the mines because we need that +3 resources now or this mission ends.
Hey, I heard that Poland, did you see that story about Poland making This War of Mine required reading for students?
Mm-hmm. So that is my
brother lives there. My brother lives there, and I haven't heard about that.
So that is my final point, because for once, I don't want to be the guy that is the reason why we're here for an extra 30 minutes, so I will throw it around to the table. Do you have any final thoughts on our topic for tonight?
I'll go, I guess.
Yeah, go for it.
I got to say that I think the topic is really deeply foundational to what we do. That, with a little bit of exploration, you realize that the idea of narrative exists in everything we're doing. It's just at different time scales. And I think maybe in this particular case, we're maybe focusing a little bit more on the longer time scale and what the larger story is. But like in recent times, I feel like my entire thesis on what game design is involves knowing the story you want to tell and creating mechanics that allow players to influence outcomes that are in the context of that story.
Okay.
Cool. Let's see. What can I say? I feel stories are crucial to games. They are needed to build character and needed to provide motivation and needed for emotional support. But I do feel that they are no more important than the other parts of the game, like the mechanics or the physics or the art. I don't think they should take precedence of the other parts of the game. I think when they do, we lessen our art form, and we make it not as good as a game as it could be, especially when stories don't have meaningful play associated with them, and they're just put in there flippantly for color. I think that's a disservice to the people playing the games.
I would say I sort of disagree with Jack a little bit. I think some of the best games that I've played seem like they're narrative first. They seem like all the mechanics support those. But I think I definitely get what you're saying, whereas like mechanics are the thing that you do. Like you watch a movie, you listen to music, you play a game. So in no way should those suffer for anything really, not just the narrative. And I think that the best games that I want to, or the games that I try to make as a developer, are games that are fun to play, but also have this cohesive double-sidedness to them, where they kind of have a narrative that explains what you're doing, and they have mechanics that feel like they fit within the narrative. And I don't know if it's possible to make a perfect marrying of the two, but I think that's something that I've been really, really obsessed about. So that's something I'm going to keep trying to do.
Good debate.
I think it really depends, kind of thing. Like if you're doing an RPG kind of thing, like story needs to be absolutely a key focus of that. If you're doing a hack and slash, story can be pretty well on the bottom kind of thing. But I wouldn't ever exclude story. I think any game can be made better with a good story, but it has to be a good story. And I think that to make a story truly good, it needs to at least tie in somewhat with the gameplay mechanics and whatnot, so you don't get that dissonance kind of effect. So, like, I feel like, I have this saying that, like, I think story belongs in every game. That's the reason why I'm putting story right now in a multiplayer only card game. And you're like, where do you put it in the multiplayer card game without, dragging down the multiplayer part? Because who wants to be, sitting there waiting on a 20, let's just say a 5-minute cutscene before they go into their match. Like, who wants that? Nobody. But who would, like, instead of seeing a 45-second timer on their matchmaking, would like to see a cutscene there for, like, the first 30 seconds and then have 15 seconds left of matchmaking before they go into a match and play it. I mean, like, I don't think anybody would disagree that would be far better than just watching a timer go down for 30 seconds, 45.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think for myself, again, everyone knows that I'm the mechanic guy. Like, for me, it's always going to be gameplay first, story second. But it does seem like for the games that do tend to rise up, the ones that do become, the big names or the most successful ones, they do find a way of bringing the two together. And I think to Tomo's point, that it really is about, this marriage of narrative mechanics versus, again, separating them into two very separate aspects. As Jack said, that if the narrative becomes the singular focus, like, it does, I don't think those games work as well. Again, like, my issues with stuff like Tomb Raider and games that try to put the story front, but then the story is just completely ignored or has nothing to do with the mechanics.
Well, I wouldn't really consider that story first. I mean, like, the story first, I would think, would be Disco Elysium, which worked out quite well, in my opinion.
Yeah. But it still had some very interesting mechanics with the whole choose-your-own-adventure aspect of it. And I think, again,
you can't just ignore the other parts of the game. I mean, like, the story may be the focus, but it can't be the entire thing unless you're writing a visual novel.
Yeah. And again, like, Disco Elysium, I think, being like the perfect example to put a cap on this discussion, is a game that the narrative and mechanics are 100% in sync with each other. And again, like, it's one of those cases where, like, the industry goes from a period before Disco Elysium came out and then after Disco Elysium came out. Like, everybody hasn't, stopped talking, or everybody didn't stop talking about that game following its success. But I think with that, let us wrap things up. I think doing, like, a single topic may be kind of, like, better for keeping these things structured. If you guys want to do that, keep it to like an hour 15, and just go all in on one topic.
Yeah, it's fine.
And it makes some sense. And they gave it this focus. It was interesting.
All right.
I had fun.
So with that, my final, round the room for social media wise. So starting with Tomo and working our way. If you guys have anything social media wise to promote, have at it.
So you can find me on Twitter at Tomo Moriwaki, TOMOMORIWAKI. Although you can find the game that my studio is working on at epictavern on Twitter, and we stream development of the game on Twitch 3 times a week. at epictavern as well.
Jack?
You can basically come look at our webpage, www.impellerstudios.com, and come see the information about In the Black. We are trying to get an early release out for this summer, so we definitely will need players. So if you guys have a chance, come over and check it out, and be ready to play the game when it comes out.
You can find me on Twitter at Tim Roswick or on twitch.tv/Tim Roswick, and on YouTube, Gamedev Underground. And that's it. I want to hang out with y'all.
You can find me on Twitter at NexusGamesINC1. You can find me on Discord at the link that Josh will have in the recorded version. And we're going to hopefully be playtesting Project Triad, our story-infused card game, hopefully here July 4th. So join the Discord and come in for that, hopefully.
All right, and I am, of course, right here on the Game Wisdom channel. You can find me on Twitter at GWBicer. We have our Discord down below, and I am currently taking on the task of writing not one but two different books on game design. I have my first book number 3 going to be about roguelike design. That is going to be due at the publisher at the end of August, and then early next year will be horror design. And if you check out my Patreon, donations of $15 or more will earn you acknowledgement in either or both of those books, depending upon what you would like. But, gentlemen, it has been a pleasure hanging out with you. Like I said at the start, we're going to shoot to do these at least once a month, probably around the 3rd week, possibly on Tuesdays. So, we will see all of you again next time. I will be back later on for our regular game stream. So, everybody, have a great rest of your night, stay safe, and come back for daily discussions on game design here and on Game Wisdom, where we examine the art and science of games. Till then,
Bye.
take care.
See ya.